there's a book called The Buzz About Bees that if you haven't seen it, it's a great book. A Swiss author, Jürgen Tautz or something like that. And he does a lot about that. He basically maintains that we should consider bees a mammal because the creature is warm-blooded. It doesn't lose its temperature. It keeps its body at right about our body temperature. And it's furry, and it feeds its babies a milk-like substance, royal jelly. So he maintains it should be a mammal. I don't really think the bees care. You know, what we call them mammals or insects. Individually, they certainly look like insects, but we made up both of those names, you know, and so what does it really matter? But he very much looks at the creature as the whole organism. It's an amazing creature because it can get really small and just stay warm in a cold space and slowly eat its way through honey and pollen. And then when it's time, it can start to grow its population and get bigger and bigger, and it can go from 2,000 bees up to 80,000 bees. Wow. And then it's like this kind of volatile creature that sends off little pieces of itself everywhere to lick nectar out of flowers and rub themselves all over with pollen and pack that on. And it lives entirely off the produce of flowers. Honeybees and flowers are hand in glove. There would be no flowers if there weren't bees, and there would be no bees if there weren't flowers. In some ways you could say that the earth would be very inhospitable to humans if it weren't for pollinators, because you could say vegetables and fruit aren't in our diet. That's like, ooh, that'd be a hard, in Jamaica they'd die, you know, I mean, they literally would die, because vegetables and fruit are a huge part of their diet, and it's a healthy part of our diet, and we need it. Grains, dairy, and meat. I'm not a vegetarian. A lot of Jamaicans are. The Rastas are all strict vegans, but you know, without fruits and vegetables, we'd be in serious, serious trouble. A big part of our nutrition. And so the problem that bees have is that they're gathering all this from flowers while they're available, but they have to gauge when do they become unavailable and then quickly shut down and shrink and then just subsist on what they've stored until they become available again and then swell back up and gather. And it's a really amazing creature. And everywhere in the world is a little different. So in New Mexico, we've got long, cold winters. People think, oh, you're from New Mexico, it must be warm. I lived up in the mountains. I was recently down to 25 below zero, commonly down to 10 below zero. And, you know, we don't have anything blooming October till about, well, up there in the mountains till about June. You know, we can have a long, cold winter. And then we get these intense summers. So those bees have to be, and, you know, a good book there is Honeybee Ecology by Tom Seeley. It's one of his old books. He compares Africanized and temperate bees in terms of their behaviors given the climates that they live in. Shows how African behaviors of absconding and swarming quickly and stinging readily make perfect sense in the tropics. Mm-hmm. But a temperate bee has to be really careful about swarming because it's so hard to get through the winter. So you don't want to break yourself into lots of little pieces that aren't going to make it. You want to make that when you've got lots of strength, make a great big swarm, and hope that they've got plenty of resources so they both can build up and survive next winter. Whereas in the tropics, well, cast a swarm, it'll probably survive. Cast another swarm, because there's always some flowers around, and you don't need big colonies. So we have all these bees that come in from all over the world into the United States, and we've, just like our people, and we've mixed them all up, and now the feral bees are sort of sifting through that genetics and adapting to our local regions. But we need to treat the colony as a creature. There are certain bees in that creature that dedicate themselves to pushing air. So they're like the lungs of that creature. They're bringing in the good air and sending out the bad air. And they're just positioned around the hive, and they're fanning their wings, and they're just moving air. They're breathing. The colony is breathing because of their effort. So they help the creature, and they're very much oriented to how do we make the whole creature thrive. I'll just, as if they were all full. And then eventually they'll start building comb back. And initially the brood nest might be that big. In the late spring, they'll just be brooding, putting as much brood in there as they can. If you were to plot the graph population, and the January, February, March, July, August, September, November, October. September, October, November. Yeah, this is my dyslexia coming through. I think I got it right there. Okay, so in New Mexico, and this is where I might need your help. Like in New Mexico, it would be it'd be very low in here. Maybe in March, it would start to pick up a little bit. And then in April, it would go up a lot in May. Now, then, if they swarmed, it would go suddenly down, or instantly down, and then go right back up. And eventually, June, July, and August, it gets as high as it can get. If the queen can't lay more than 2,000 eggs a day. That's just already an amazing feat, and it's just not going to get higher than that. So eventually, if X% of the bees are dying of old age, that's 2,000 are dying a day, and she can't raise the population anymore. That's where, by the way, worker longevity becomes a very important issue. Because if the workers are only living 5 weeks, then the whole population comes way down to here. Whereas if they're living 6 weeks, the longevity greatly increases the population. It's exponential. So why is that important? Because Apistan reduces worker longevity, Coumaphos, Amitraz, all those things have a very negative effect on worker longevity. So there's another reason why we shouldn't be treating. But eventually it tapers off, and then about September it starts to plummet, and in October and November it really plummets, and it goes back to its wintertime thing. And if we were to plot drones, there would be no drones, and maybe about in April there'd be a few drones, and they'd kind of spike, and then they'd kind of putz along at a low level and then disappear in September or so. And then they wouldn't raise any drones. So you can think of this as a hermaphroditic superorganism. It has male and female parts, but it can withdraw the male part completely and disappear it, and then extend it when it's in season.
Does the population vary by the average temperature of the day, or is it by number of hours of daylight? How do they know whether they have a big population or small?
So it does. It varies by the day length and by floral resources. So when certain and that depends on the genetics of the bee. So the Italian bees are much more responsive to day length. So once the days get longer, we're getting ready for summer, and we don't really care because they're from the Mediterranean, and apparently it's a nice steady. The days get longer, the temperatures are warm. There's rosemary and thyme in the hills, and they can just count on it like clockwork. Whereas up in the mountains of like the Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia, where the Caucasian honeybee is from, where I've been there, those bees are much more like, it's nice warm days, but it could get really cold, and we need flowers. And when flowers come in, we're going to expand, and as soon as they slow down, we're going to start to contract. And so some races of bee are more responsive to floral resources to cause their population explosion.
Well, so in a population like this where there's floral resources year-round, do you still need to keep those 12 bars?
No, you might get away with less, but you don't want to get down too low. It's always better to leave them a little more. Like what I tell people in New York is maybe leave them 15. Make sure they have enough, right? And then if after 3 or 4 years you've left them 15 and they've always kept 4 completely full of honey and never needed it, well then you're leaving them too much and you could have harvested that honey. But it's a lot better to leave them more honey than they need than to go there and find out, they starved to death and I couldn't do anything about it. And I don't like to feed bees. If I can avoid feeding bees, I hardly ever feed bees. Once or twice in the last 15 years, I've had to feed a few hives. I had a bunch of hives in Santa Fe that I went and had no honey whatsoever and had gone down in population, and were going to starve to death. And I feed bees crystallized honey that I buy from a friend of mine that I know he doesn't use miticides or antibiotics, and I just carve a chunk of it out of the bucket with my hive tool and plop it on the bottom inside the hive, and they go and eat it. So I don't have my minimalistic tendencies. I don't have even a feeder device or anything. It's just a chunk of honey laying on the floor, and they just eat it.
Do you do that in the middle of winter?
No, well, I try to always, so I did this in the middle of the summer because they were starving to death. New Mexico's gotten really hard to keep bees in. The drought has been, like where I used to live down in the southern part of the state, they went last year a year and a half without any moisture of any kind. No rain, no snow, no nothing. And so then they got a 4-inch thunder shower in about 1 hour, and it washed everything away and didn't help much.
We teach a Washington State Master Beekeeping Certification Program, or Beekeeper Certification Program, and part of their curriculum teaches you as far as overwintering your hives and how much honey to leave. And I think up in Washington State, they are recommending between 60 to 80 pounds of honey to overwinter your bees. Here in Santa Barbara, we've been kind of telling people to adjust that probably down to 40, 50 pounds of honey. Do you have any idea on your size Langstroth or top bar hive, how much weight there is in a capped top bar frame?
It's about,
not even a frame.
About, no frames, combs, but about 4.5 pounds.
4.5?
Yeah. And so and when I first put them in my first top bar hive, and I thought, well, they didn't store enough honey, they're not going to make it through the winter. And I didn't bother to help them. I thought, well, if they don't, maybe that's a drawback to this hive. And then they made it through and they had a lot of honey left over. And it appears to me that they were needing less honey, but this is a supposition that needs testing, that they were needing less honey in the top bar hives than they were in the Langstroths. And I have a potential reason for that. And that is that in my Langstroths, well, what I was using for my Langstroths actually was 3, 6, and 5/8 boxes. Because, it was just, then I used the same for my supers. And basically you're kind of forcing them to crowd themselves down into here at the end of the summer, at the beginning of the winter. And then they're going to slowly eat their way up. And often then I would reverse these boxes, like, at the beginning of the spring they'd be in here and there'd be quite a bit of honey and maybe a little brood in here, and this would be empty. And I'd put this on top and this on the bottom, and that was my beginning of swarm prevention, right? And then they'd eventually fill up the whole thing, with brood, and then I'd put supers on. But what I thought is, if they're down here at the bottom, and they're getting really cold, and they're respiring, and I think that the cluster is kind of a cool thing. Somebody had asked about the heat. The cluster reminds me a lot of the old diagrams of the Earth, where there's places where the magma is hot and it's rising, and then it cools off and it falls. Well, the cluster's doing the same thing. Bees are coming up, and then bees are getting cold and they're going back in, and they're staying in this cluster. And then there are some bees in the center of the cluster that nowadays with infrared photography, we can see that they're just holding on and they're just burning honey with their wing muscles. And they're burning through their mitochondrial, energy in their ATP and their mitochondria. They're shortening their lives, but they're just pouring heat out of their bodies. And they're heating up the whole cluster. And so they're designated heater bees, and they just keep that whole cluster warm. Their warm air is rising a little bit above them, but 3 inches on either side of them, it's the same temperature as it is outside. So they're not really keeping the whole box warm. They're just keeping the cluster warm, and there's a plume of heat above them. And if that has very far to rise, it eventually condenses and drips right back on them. And it makes a little bit of moldy stuff up there. So with a top bar or any horizontal hive, they're pretty close to the top, and they're moving sideways instead of up. And the Russians have been using horizontal framed hives called Russian long boxes for a long time, all the way through Siberia and everywhere. So I feel that the horizontal design requires them less work. And I don't know, but at any rate, so yeah, I'm leaving them to 12. And then I'm beginning to pull some of those back and expand. And I'm trying to pull out the darkest ones to use to put in the back here and draw them back. And you know, that partly came from a book that a man from Sri Lanka wrote. He wrote Beekeeping for Honey Production in Sri Lanka. His name was Dr. Punchiwewa. And he had these great diagrams. I have that book in my pickup. It's one of everything I own is in my pickup right now. And I realize I hardly own, my pickup's half empty. And I have, a service bed Dodge, so it's a big pickup. But really, my clothes and some books, and I've given away I don't have much except for bees. But I have that book, and it made really great diagrams. That's where these diagrams, the idea for these diagrams came from, was from his book, because it had these color diagrams that were really helped me visualize, because I'm not that quick. It's not that easy for me to read sometimes.
Unless that's the part I don't quite understand, that getting the old comb out when you think that it's probably time to get it out, and it's there in those 12 combs.
Yeah,
At
let's say
what
this one
time
is.
of year are you doing that, and how do you do it so you're not pulling out brood and stuff like that?
Right. So in the spring, what I'll find is that these are empty. There's some brood here, and then maybe there's 2 or 3 combs of honey left in the very back. Well, any of the like, let's say there's a real old dark comb in the empties. So he's using Apis cerana as a different bee, but he increased the honey production from 2 to 20 kilograms per year. These are Langstroth hives that get to be about that tall, and they're little tiny, like mini Langstroth hives. They're really cool. I want to go build some top bar hives, and there's a lady in China that I might go work with to see if I can do that. So then I would take these, and that would become my follower comb that I'm constantly moving back. And then once it fills with honey, I take it, crush it, and it's gone. Okay. And then if there's a comb with brood in it, I might put it towards the back of the brood nest and just keep trying to inch it out of the brood nest until, and often, if it's near the back of the brood nest, she doesn't like to lay eggs in real old black comb. So she'll abandon it, and then I can move it until it fills with honey, and then crush it.
So you may
And then I cut the combs off right into the bucket with no bees. Try to never get a bee in the bucket. And put the empty top bar right back. And then I leave maybe a little ½ inch of comb on the top bar as a template to get them started again. And then take those buckets home. I also take an empty top bar with no door on it out. And if I come to a nice comb that is all kept and no brood has ever been in it, I just take the whole comb and brush the bees off and put it in that other hive to take home with me whole. And I just trade a top bar. So that the box in my truck is full of top bars. So then I take a comb and bring the top bar over here. Then I lay out on a cookie sheet at the house, and I cut comb honey out of it. And there's no cost in there in materials for me, right? And comb honey is becoming really a good seller. People are doing buying lots of comb honey lately. So that so that means often one comb can make me about $40. So it's pretty good. And then the little trimmings that don't fit, then they go in with the other. I crush all those combs, and then I pour them over a strainer. And so on the small scale, that can be a colander and a mixing bowl. You don't need to buy anything. You can just crush your combs over a colander that's sitting on top of a big bowl, and the honey will drip through, and the wax will sit in the colander, and you'll have your honey, right? You just pour that into a bottle, and now you don't need any equipment. You don't need an extractor or any of that stuff. And on the larger scale, then, you just need, I have 300-pound tanks. They're like 30-gallon tanks with a valve, and then a strainer They make, so these are made for when you're extracting, then the honey's coming out into a 5-gallon bucket, and then you shut the extractor and pour the bucket through this strainer that strains out the big chunks of wax. And then the honey goes into the tank where you can then bottle it or strain it or whatever you do. Well, I just take and crush all the combs and pour the wax honey slurry, so to speak, into the strainers. And I can pour about almost 2 buckets worth into a strainer. And then it just sits there and the wax stays up in the strainer and a little bit goes through, but hardly any, and then the honey drips through. And then I just go right to the retail bottle with it right out of that tank. I don't strain it beyond that.
How long do you think it takes to get the honey, let the honey strain?
If in a warm place, about 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to do it in a warm, southern exposed room with some windows and keep it warm. And I may turn it, I may fluff it up once. And then I take that sticky wax out where bees can get to it and let the bees clean it up. Or you could even put it in a hive if you wanted to. And let the bees mine through it and clean it up and then scrape it up. And then it would have to be a weak hive that there was lots of room, right? But that's the perfect hive to maybe need to feed anyway. And then I scrape it up and I put it in a solar melter, which my solar melter is simply a bathtub, tipped a little bit to the south on a cinder block. I didn't tip it very much, but and a shower curtain door over it. And I pour in a little bit of like a quart of water, and then the sun passes over and it melts all the wax out of the cocoons and propolis and maybe a dead bee or two that's in whatever's in there, and the wax floats over the water. In the morning it's cooled all night and it's now solid, and then I pry it up and throw it in a bucket and put it, maybe scrape up if the pile of cocoons and stuff is here, I'll scrape that till I come to more wax, and then I'll just let the sun pass over another day till I get down to the bottom, and then I'll put in more. And so it's a very simple process where you get very clean, nice bright yellow wax, even at a really old black comb. I think the sun bleaches a little bit, but it doesn't. And another thing that doesn't cost me anything, no propane, no. Then that wax I do double boil it when I make candles. And what I'm going to just advocate is, and this could be a whole nother class someday, is your beeswax can make, especially from a top bar hive where you make about 6 times as much as you do in a Langston, your beeswax can make as much honey, as much money as your honey. And if you're creative with your beeswax, especially if you're not using miticides, your beeswax is not contaminated with the miticides. Japanese cosmetic companies used to buy American beeswax and they won't touch it because it's so contaminated with poison, basically. Right? So if your wax isn't, you could be making lip balm and salve or selling it to people who are going to make lip balm and salve, mixing in some propolis tinctures or herbs and coming up with all kinds of amazing things. I have a picture in my computer of this woman from Venezuela. She's got a whole store full of herbal honeys and herbal salves and ointments. And her herbal honeys are like ginger, so she cuts up ginger, dries it lightly, and then soaks honey in it. And this you'd have to get a food approval for, because if it's not just honey in a jar, then you might need to get the health department to sign off on it. But we should work on that, because I think it's safe if you dry the herbs enough before you put, so that you're not getting wet honey in there. And so she has, these herbal honeys for coughs, influenza, impotence, you name it. All these different kinds of herbal honeys, and then all these salves that, like the turmeric and the beeswax. And so there's a whole lot of possibilities of entering into the realm of some semi-medicinal products.